Martin Luther is, of course, where the Great Reformation really begins. But, of course, based upon previous lessons, and if you look at your history, you'll note that the Reformation spirit and the whole process of reform really does not begin with him. There are continual reformers throughout the history of the Church. Martin Luther himself, when he looked back at Jan Hus, one of the Czech reformers who was eventually executed by the Church for his confrontation of things like indulgences, Martin Luther referred to him in many ways as the father of what he was doing some 100+ years before he even came along. While Luther was born in the year 1483 in Saxony, his father was in the mining, actually the copper mining business, and his father wanted Luther to become something more noble than a typical merchant class tradesman of some type. In fact, he wanted Martin Luther specifically to become a doctor of letters, or really a lawyer. And so he sent Martin Luther to the best Latin schools, which is interesting at the time. The best Latin schools in the area were the Brethren of the Common Life schools. That is where Luther was sent. That is where he was given his original classical education, which really primarily was an education in actual classical languages. But it's interesting, he grew up this way and really despised school, which I'm sure you can't relate to. But he really despised the whole idea of being forced to do something that he did not understand, and which was both a search for understanding. It was also, of course, a form of just rebelling against actual authority. But it's around this time that he's pursuing this whole career in law that he encounters a great lightning storm. And in this lightning storm, he fears for his life. In fact, he was caught out in the open, in the countryside, had no place really for shelter. And so he gives a prayer to Saint Anna, and he prays to her that if she and the rest of the saints and Christ himself would save him, that he would promise to become an Augustinian friar, or essentially a monk. He indeed was saved from the lightning storm, as you know, and he became this monk or this friar, and eventually rose to become both a priest and a professor at Wittenberg, at the great university there in Wittenberg, one of the hearts of learning there in the Germanies. It's interesting, it's during this time that he begins to fall under the influence of a great mentor, and this mentor does something with Luther. He encourages him to actually read scriptures for himself. And Luther begins to do this. But it's during this whole process that Luther, who is so concerned with things like sacerdotalism, which implies, according to Aquinas, that Christ is continually being sacrificed in some way or another, that his whole shedding of his blood has an eternal quality to it, so therefore it's not once and for all. And Luther kind of feeling the weight of that guilt, and just wanting to be sure, how can I know that I'm really going to end up with God forever? He was often, it was through this that he often panicked and would pray things like, Lord Jesus, I am yours, save me, which is a very real sentiment. But it's the constant fear of losing his salvation that is important to understand where Luther eventually goes, and why he finally finds comfort by understanding who God's character is, or what God's character is through his unchanging nature. Anyway, we know about his actual person, his actual character, was that he himself had some significant brawn. He was rather stout. He was said to have a booming voice. He was noted for being rather earthy, sometimes downright crass. He was also known for being very personable. The way that he discipled men was he met in groups with them, typically at some type of beer hall, and they not only talked theology and drank beer, but they talked very practically how they would actually take care of their wives, both physically and mentally and spiritually as well. But prior to him really developing that whole personal nature, which was a direct product of the Reformation that he helped to spearhead, prior to all of that, his mentor sent him to Rome. And the reason for him sending to Rome was Luther wanted to see the heart of the church. And so his mentor encouraged him to go. Part of the reason his mentor encouraged him to do this was so that Luther could see what the church had actually become. It's very interesting how you see this repeated nature going on, because often Christians often hamstring themselves to the world in terms of their witness, because we have so much corruption in the church, we have so much sin in the church, it's us. It's myself. It is those who are around us. And I'm not talking about things that necessarily deserve church discipline. I'm just talking about the very nature of us, period, as hypocrites. But of course, what Luther was dealing with is the same thing that we deal with on a regular basis. It is the actual corruption, the actual criminal activity that you sometimes see in clergy. He traveled to Rome, and there's a story I did want to tell you here. If you remember, there's a story by Boccaccio, which I have mentioned to many of you before. But in this story, there are two characters who live in Italy. One is a believer, one is not. He really doubts the fact that God could actually exist, or that this whole story of the Christ, which is governed by this rather overbearing church, could ever possibly be true. It just seems like a power move to him. And so the unbeliever eventually tells the believer, I'm going to actually go to Rome. I'm going to go to the heart of your faith, so to speak, and actually see it for myself. Well, the believer has been to Rome himself. He knows the corruption. He knows the actual amount of wealth that is displayed by the clergy while people starve, and they actually walk by these starving people. He knows the amount of prostitutes and brothels to be found where the various Dominicans and Augustinian friars go to visit. And he doesn't want his unbelieving friend to see those things because he knows that they will somehow sour the entire testimony of what he's been telling him to be true. But of course, he cannot prevent his friend from going and exercising his right to go. So the unbeliever goes to Rome, he witnesses the corruption, he witnesses all the licentiousness, and then he comes back to his friend who presumably is kind of sheepish by this whole point and doesn't really actually want to bring up the whole issue of what his friend saw in Rome, that now essentially disproves everything he's ever said about the gospel.